we have been discussing how historians try to read, reconstruct political history by using diverse types of sources, particularly inscriptions and coins. We just referred to the use of various types of time reckoning systems, the use of eras, and also the use of regnal years of rulers as markers of interesting political changes or interesting political developments. There can be sometimes confusing political scenarios, and how the historian approaches to clear the confusion through inscriptions can be, we can have an instance of that. There were two rulers of the exactly same name. One was Mahendrapala of the Pala dynasty, the other was Mahendrapala of the Gurjara dynasty. Now in inscriptions, if the record did not tell us about the genealogy or the family history of one of these Mahendrapalas, then how one determines which Mahendrapala of which dynasty we are referring to? How to distinguish between the two, because both are homonymous rulers. The indication is the Palas always used the regnal year of the ruler as the dating system of their inscriptions, while in sharp contrast to this practice, the Gurjara Pratiharas used the time reckoning system of a particular era known as the Vikrama Samvat, which the first year corresponds to 57 BCE. So, by comparing or having a close look at which regnal reckoning is used in a particular inscription of either of these Mahendrapalas, one can easily find out where the ruler was ruling, which dynasty he belongs to. In South India, for example, the Cholas used their inscription to update political events. So, if a new conquest took place, say in the 10th regnal year of a great ruler like Rajaraja Rajendra, the inscription of the 10th regnal year will update the new political information along with incorporating earlier political achievements of that ruler. This is a remarkable practice which definitely shows the importance of keeping proper records in the court of major political achievements, particularly achievements in war, conquest, etc. in the Cholo court. From around 700 AD onwards, a particular type of literary text called the Charitas, eulogies on the life of a particular political ruler, began to be composed. The tendency started with Harshacharita by Banabhatta, that speaks of the deeds of Harsha. We have indicated that it is not free from its limitation, and obviously having hyperbolic statements, it constantly has to be checked and verified with other contemporary sources. Similarly, Sandhyakara Nandi's Ramacharitam speaks of the gradual waning of the mighty Pala power, and in fact the last flicker of its existence during the time of Ramapala, who tried to recapture a lost territory, Varendri, present-day northern part of Bangladesh, which the Palas lost, and how he recovered forms the major description of the Ramacharitam. It revolves around the career of Ramapala and brings many interesting political aspects of the last phase of Pala rule in northern Bengal. Similarly, there is the Vikramanka Devacharita of Bildhana of the 11th century on the career and achievements of a powerful South Indian ruler, Vikramaditya VI. If we mean a fascinating textual account to speak of the politics in a particular region, then the text par excellence is Karlana's Rajat Ragini, perhaps the really top-class historical chronicle written in ancient times. This text gives a connected account of the history of Kashmir from a very remote times, and Kallana before 7th century has to write on many hearsays, legends, tales. His account from 7th century AD onwards is quite solid, factual, and was based on evidence available to him. We have to keep in mind that Kallana belongs to 12th century, and he in fact says that he checked, read, studies earlier evidence in the form of coins, in the form of accounts, in the form of dynastic chronicles, and he approaches these sources. He himself shows how he used earlier sources and surprises us with remarkable balance and critical judgment. In fact, Ramila Thapar sees the culmination of the Itihasa Purana type of textual narrative in Kallana's Rajat Ragini. We find that for the understanding of political history, inscriptions and coins are perhaps of the most useful value, but it has to be often checked and verified with other kinds of texts, sometimes Puranic accounts, sometimes other chronicles, and also texts like the Charitas highlighting the careers of important political personalities. From politics and political history, we may now move to the use of sources for understanding polity, political institution. We are now entering into the realm of institutional history. How institutions could be studied in the light of ancient sources. In terms of ancient India, we understand or often take for granted when we talk about polity that everything is monarchical. Why? Because from the earliest known literary texts of India, that is the Vedic Corpus and particularly the Rig Veda, the term Raja is already available. And therefore, many historians, particularly of the late 19th century and the 1920s, 30s, 1940s, straightforward translated the term Raja as king, which is quite valid. But a more critical analysis of the Vedic corpus and particularly the Rig Veda, when situated in the context of other evidence available from the same Vedic corpus, now shows that the term Raja rarely stood for the head of a monarchical state. It actually speaks of chieftains, because the Rajas in the Vedic corpus are rarely associated with any territorial position. They often figure as the head or the chief of a particular clan. Now, this combination of the study of certain vocabulary in a text situated in its context opens up new possibilities of understanding the political institution. If the Vedic corpus does not acquaint us with full-fledged monarchical setup, it is very much in keeping with the references to certain kinds of bodies which may be called popular assemblies figuring in the Vedic corpus, like the Sabha, the Samiti and the Vidatha. Now, these were popular assemblies where popular participation is possible, and that goes well with our image that this was a polity where full-fledged monarchy has not yet developed, and therefore popular assemblies were quite active. For the understanding of the non-monarchical elements in polity, one can easily turn one's attention to the Pali canonical texts and the Jaina texts in Prakrit language that speaks very regularly about the Ganarajyas, Ganasanghas, that is the non-monarchical groups. These non-monarchical groups do figure also in Brahmanical normative treatises like the Arthashastra, like the Manu Samhita, like the Shanti Parvan of the Mahabharata. In these texts, however, the Brahmanical texts, Brahmanical normative texts, there is an apprehension, a reaction against these popular assemblies, and particularly the non-monarchical institution called the Ganasanghas or Sanghas or the Ganarajyas. While the Buddhist and the Jaina texts openly celebrate the non-monarchical institutions and the political activities in those non-monarchical Ganarajyas. So one can easily see the kind of contrast in the attitude of the Brahmanical texts and the non-Brahmanical texts like the Buddhist texts and the Jaina texts towards non-monarchical institutions. It goes without saying that texts, particularly normative treatises and Buddhist canonical texts, throw immense lights on the institution of monarchy. Though the Buddhist texts were essentially religious and have very little to do with political organization, it is from a story in the Digha Nikaya that historians like U.N. Ghoshal, R.S. Sharma, Ramila Thapar and many others traced the element of some kind of an agreement, a contract between the people and the ruler before the ruler becomes a ruler. Therefore, they argue that in the light of this Digha Nikaya story, one can see the germs of a contractual origin of the monarchical polity. Similarly, the monarchical polity appears in a very major way in the text of Kautilya Arthashastra, the Manu Samhita, the Mahabharata, particularly the Shanti Parvan section of the Mahabharata, in which the ideals of rulership, ideal functions of the ruler can be seen. Particularly in Manu Samhita and the Mahabharata, the king is seen almost as a divinity. Manu's dictum was, the king is verily a god in human form, and therefore even an infant king could not be disobeyed. Now, does it have any repercussion, or were these merely theoretical statements? Now, if one brings in here the sources, inscriptional sources, coins and some sculptures of the Kushana phase, we find that in the inscriptions the Kushanas called themselves son of God, Devaputra. In one case, one Kushana ruler figures as Deva Manusha, exactly echoing Manu's sentiment, a god in human form. And Kushana rulers encouraged the practice of creating statues, frontal statues of the rulers to be propitiated in dynastic sanctuaries called Devakulas. These have been seen in sculptures, in actual remains of the architecture of the Devakula, and also figuring in inscriptions. This is how we find the textual prescriptions and the evidence of coins, inscriptions and even visual arts give a combined effect, and shows how the idea of the ruler being a divinity or having divine origin is gaining ground. Similarly, the normative treatises lay down the various bases of or principles of tax collection. Why the ruler and how the ruler should collect taxes. The maxims are laid down in the Dharma Shastras. While if one looks at the inscriptions, particularly land grant charters from say 400 AD onwards, one comes across a very large number of revenue terms and also officials entrusted with the collection of those revenues. What does it tell us? Take for example the well-known Chinese pilgrim, Fa Xian, in 5th century AD, while traveling in greater parts of North India, Central India, suggested that the burden of taxation for Indian population was rather light, and it was a very lenient taxation system. If one tries to compare the data from the Gupta period inscriptions and the Vakataka inscriptions from Central India, it shows a completely contrary picture. It shows that in fact the burden of taxation and the diversification of revenue demands was ever on the increase, including the terrible custom of imposing forced labor, which is called Vishti and which figures very prominently in the inscriptions. So there are diverse types of images coming out of different sources. Similarly, R.S. Sharma, one of the most respected historians of ancient India, used a text on architecture, Aparajita Pricha, to suggest how the author of this Sanskrit text proposed to have different types of palaces for different grades of rulers. That is, for a sovereign ruler, the kind of palace is far bigger than the habitat or the dwelling house of a relatively smaller underlord or a subordinate vassal. Now, Sharma's idea was not to visualize how the royal palaces would have looked like in the light of this prescription. He used this particular text purely on architecture to indicate how even the texts on architecture was largely influenced by the idea of political hierarchy between the lord and his vassals, and therefore built up his concept of Indian feudalism, the concept of political fragmentation. There were many other sources used, particularly the evidence of land grants, the emergence of the Samantas or the underlords to great prominence, in fact at the cost of the central political authority. But with that, he used in addition an architectural text to indicate how the element of political hierarchy influenced a text on architecture. In this way, we find the diverse types of sources can generate multiple types of information which can be collated together and therefore can give a very complex image. In this way, we can also illustrate how in the last 2 decades, the profusion of inscriptions in South India, there are tens of thousands of inscriptions in South India, either on copper plate charters or inscribed on the walls of the temples, that speaks of the transfer of revenue from certain villages to a big temple, usually instituted and constructed at the patronage of a great Cholo ruler. Now, what is the importance? Since there is a plethora of such data, this epigraphic information could be fed to computer, and what is something very rare in early Indian history, some amount of statistical data regarding land settlement, regarding boundary demarcations of villages, the importance of local self bodies vis-a-vis officers of the central or the apex political authority, how they act and interact, these have come out. And this kind of efforts have been undertaken by Y. Subbarayalu, by Toro Matsui, by Noburo Karashima, and there is an international collaboration among epigraphists, among social historians, among political historians and economic historians to give a multifaceted understanding of the political institutions. Very interestingly, in the Chola realm, if we see very powerful monarchs figuring in inscriptions, figuring in Tamil literary texts, like the Kalingattupparani of Jayan Gondar eulogizing the great career of Kulothunga Chola I. there were also in the inscriptions regular mention of elected bodies at rural level. The Ur in the non-Brahmana villages and the Sabha in Brahmana villages. And inscriptions give details of how these popular bodies functioned even when there were very powerful monarchical authorities at the apex level. In fact, this is a very peculiar combination which is not directly known from prescriptive sources, but it comes to our light through the descriptive sources like inscriptions. After all, from the sources or the study of the sources, as I said before, one generally cannot have a single conclusive closed assessment of the situation. The situation is always changing from one period to another, and it is also changing in terms of the changing perspective of the historian.